We're the All People's Health Collective, where organizers, advocates, and everyday people come together to demand care, housing, and freedom for all. APHC is fighting for care without control, housing without conditions, and dignity for every person.
Well, thank you so much for joining the All People's Health Collective podcast today, Andy. To start off, can you just introduce yourself and your current role at Disability Rights California, and just tell us a little bit about your career and your journey into advocacy and disability rights work?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Susan. So my name's Andy Imparato. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Chief Executive Officer at Disability Rights California. I am based in Sacramento, and that's where I am today. We are a large disability advocacy organization that's statewide. In California, we have over 300 staff, over 100 attorneys. And we think we're the largest disability advocacy organization in the United States. If there's another one that's bigger than us, we're not aware of it. I, I grew up in Southern California, went to law school in Northern California, started my career in Boston. And, when I graduated law school, I knew I wanted to do public interest work, what we would now call social justice work. And I found myself working in legal services in Boston, advocating for children with disabilities. And I learned about the Supplemental Security Income Program, Medicaid, other issues, and ended up gravitating towards the policy aspect of the issues. I had clients, but I was also working with the state legislature. And I found that I really enjoyed working with the legislature and trying to shape and influence policy. So I was on a 2-year fellowship. When my fellowship ended, I applied for a job in DC with Senator Tom Harkin, who at the time was the chair of the United States Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy. And I got the job and moved to DC, and then I stayed in DC for 26 years. So I spent about 5 of those years at 2 different times working for Senator Harkin, 2 different points in his career and my career. And then I worked at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the National Council on Disability, the American Association of People with Disabilities, and the Association of University Centers on Disabilities over the course of the 26 years. So I kind of feel like I did the same job the whole time. I saw myself as a soldier in a movement, and I picked jobs where I thought I could have the most impact. I didn't worry too much about my job description or whether I was inside or outside the government. And luckily, I had bosses that, were willing to give me some free rein. I have bipolar disorder or manic depression, and I think that is part of the reason I've stayed in this field as long as I have. I feel like I have a stake, a lived experience that gives me insight and credibility on the work that I do. And for whatever reasons, I found from the very beginning of my career that it was more interesting to think about all disabilities than just mental health or just my own disability. So my whole career has been cross disability. I've never focused on just one part of the disability community.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing your background. And yeah, it's really interesting to hear that you spent decades, I believe, working in DC at the federal level. So I'm just wondering, what were the biggest takeaways and lessons that you learned, both good ones and hard lessons, from those decades working on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the lessons are really basic common sense lessons. So number one, policy is about relationships. So if you want to influence policy, I think you have to pay attention to relationships. And the biggest mistake that I see a lot of advocates make is in order to get a policy victory, sometimes they're willing to destroy a relationship to get there. And sometimes it's necessary. I'm not saying there aren't times where that's not the thing you need to do, but I think it's always worth asking the question, is this policy victory worth destroying this relationship to get? And oftentimes it's not. One of my colleagues, when I was working in Boston, he was an organizer with a group in Cape Cod called the Cape Organization for the Rights of the Disabled, or CORD was their acronym. But he told me, Andy, when we work on policy, we're not focused on getting the outcome. We're focused on being stronger after engaging on the issue than we were when we started. So he was focused more on, is this helping us build relationships? Is it helping us build power? And if that is working, but we lose on the policy issue, then it's still a success in his mind. And if we lose power, but we win on the policy issue, then it's actually not a success.
Totally. Specifically, I'm curious about, um, it sounds like based on the timeline I'm hearing that you were working in DC, when the ADA was in the works. You can
So
clarify if that's wrong.
yeah, the timing of my career has been interesting with the ADA. So the ADA was written in the 1980s. It started with a report from the National Council on Disability, where I later worked, um, called Toward Independence, where they made the case for, this was in 1986, they made the case for having an omnibus civil rights bill that would protect the civil rights of children and adults with all types of disabilities. The law ended up getting introduced by Senator Harkin, from Iowa, who had a brother who was deaf, and Lowell Weicker, from Connecticut, who had a kid with a disability, Tony Koala, who had epilepsy. Um, and It passed very quickly. It became law in July of 1990. So how that interacts with me, I was in law school when this was happening. I wasn't part of anything that created the Americans with Disabilities Act. I graduated from law school in May of 1992, months before the law passed, and I was dealing with a new diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So I acquired my disability and acquired a new federal civil rights law around the same time. And then I've kind of developed my career in the wake of that law. So I'm grateful to the generation of disability leaders who created the ADA. I think of myself as a second generation disability leader, not because there were people in my family who were part of the movement, but because I wasn't part of that first group that helped to craft the ADA and helped to shape the disability rights movement, that led up to the passage of the ADA.
Got it. Got it. I'm wondering if you feel comfortable though speaking, even though you weren't part of the drafting of that legislation or anything, if you feel comfortable speaking a little bit about the organizing that led up to the ADA, and what
Sure.
you kind of see as the best and worst things that came out of it.
Sure. I mean, I think the disability movement in the United States had their first big organizing victory when they were trying to get the regulations issued under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which predated the ADA. So there was an addition to the Rehabilitation Act in the early 70s, when Nixon was president. And when Carter was president, they were trying to get him to release the regulations that would basically explain what does it mean to not discriminate against people with disabilities when you have federal money. That's what Section 504 says. You can't discriminate. Back then they were calling us handicapped, but you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. If you're going to receive federal money, one of the strings attached is no discrimination against disabled people. And the Carter administration was tasked with writing the regulation that explained that, including explain who do we mean by disabled people? What's the definition? So there was a sit-in to get the regulations released because Secretary Califano, who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, was the name of the agency back then before the Department of Health and Human Services was created. He he was sitting on the regs. He thought he couldn't figure out how to do this in a way that wasn't going to piss off a bunch of people in the business community and elsewhere So he just wasn't releasing the regs. And Frank Bowe, who was a deaf leader working with a cross disability coalition, decided to do protests all over the country. So disabled people all over the country took over federal office buildings saying, release the regulations. And most of those protests were over in a couple of days, but the one in San Francisco went on for weeks. And it was the longest continuous sit-in in US history in a federal office building. And ultimately Califano caved and they released the regs. So that was, that was in 1978, but that was a kind of a really important historical moment for the disability movement. I think it helped people with disabilities realize that we have power and we have the ability to do things that lots of other people would say that are impossible. Um, so, the ADA work happened in the mid 80s and late 80s, but it was definitely inspired by the work that happened in the mid and late 70s. Um, the groups that came together to work on the ADA, uh, I would say was a broader coalition than the folks that worked on Section 504. The Section 504 coalition was largely people with physical or mobility disabilities, although it certainly included people with other types of disabilities. The ADA coalition was broader. It included the HIV/AIDS community. It included kind of the broader civil rights community. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was an important player that supported the ADA. The faith community was very involved in getting the ADA passed. Um, so I think in 1990, when the law passed, disabled people in the United States, and I was a newly disabled person at the time, uh, we felt like we had a lot of power, uh, especially the people that were plugged into what was happening. As you can imagine, most people with disabilities have no idea that they have a disability and they don't like the word or use the word disability. So the civil rights law passed, but it wasn't like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There weren't people, having hoses turned on them in the streets. A lot of the discrimination against disabled people was quiet and happening in the background, and most people didn't even recognize it as discrimination. And the strategy that was used to pass the ADA was largely a under the radar strategy. We didn't have front page headlines in newspapers about how disabled people were getting discriminated against. There were moments where things got pretty high profile. I think the Deaf President Now protest that was in the late 80s helped to lay the foundation for the ADA because it was so high profile and it was right there in front of Congress. And there was the Capitol crawl where people got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the Capitol to try to get Congress to move on the ADA. And they did that at a moment when the ADA was stuck. And the Capitol crawl helped to get it unstuck. Um, but those moments were relatively short-lived compared to, the big public fights that went on in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and other, you know, household name leaders. We didn't have household name leaders from the disability community that were leading the effort for the ADA. So I think the community felt like we had power. I think in the wake of the ADA, we realized we didn't have power. The next big fight for us was the Clinton healthcare reform bill. The Republican Party, who had been solidly with us on the ADA, was not with us on the need for healthcare reform, at least the way that Clinton was trying to do it. So we had a huge fight with the Republican Party, including Bob Dole, who had been one of the champions of the ADA and was a disabled veteran. Um, and we got rolled. The Republican Party was able to say that the Clinton bill was way too complicated and that people were going to lose their health care. And they were able to stop it. They were able to win elections saying that, they were trying to protect people's health care. And the disability voice in that debate ended up not having much impact.
And can you just clarify kind of at a high level what that bill was about?
Yeah, the Clinton bill was called the Health Security Act, and it was a precursor to what Obama ultimately was able to succeed on, but it was trying to make it so that everybody had health care and make it so that nobody would get discriminated against if they had a pre-existing condition. So basically trying to deal with all the barriers that keep people from having health care, having health insurance.
Got it. Yeah, it's super interesting to hear a little bit about the history of that movement, especially because I feel like the ADA is such a common household acronym. Everyone knows roughly what it is, but there's very little knowledge of the fight that led into it and the community that organized around it. I'm kind of curious about how your analysis of disability justice has evolved over the years through your work and how that's kind of informed your strategic advocacy and the way you think about, how you do this work as an attorney in an org like DRC.
Sure. So I think the concept of disability justice, kind of trying to say it in a plain language way, is that if you're going to advocate for disabled people, you can't ignore all of their other identities. Because if you do, then you're only advocating for a small slice of the disability community. So you can't advocate for disabled people and ignore gender. You can't advocate for disabled people and ignore race or ethnicity or language or immigration status, um, sexual identity. So I would say there was a time in the disability rights movement where, in part because we wanted to maintain bipartisan support for our issues, that we kind of felt like we should stay in our lane and just focus on disability and don't get sucked into all these other social justice issues, because it would be very hard to stay bipartisan if we were viewed as being out there on all those other issues. And I'm sure there are still people in the disability movement that feel that way, but it's a relatively small part of the movement. I think the movement over time has recognized and embraced the idea that if we want to advocate for the whole community, we actually have to pay attention to all the identities that exist in our community. It gets complicated, right? Because some of those identities include Republicans and veterans and, different folks that may be homophobic or may be sexist or racist or whatever. So, I mean, I think that happens in lots of movements, trying to figure out how to share power with people that don't agree on everything and find issues that bring people together. The issue that I've worked on the most, which I find is a good one to bring people together, is employment. I feel like, and that was also a high priority for Senator Harkin both times, but especially the second time I worked for him. Disabled people are largely not in the labor force, and when we are in the labor force, we're largely underemployed, underpaid. We're not in roles that necessarily, fit our strengths or our passions or our ambitions. So I like the employment issue. It certainly relates to economic justice and economic power. My friend Christine Griffin, who used a wheelchair, she's also a veteran. She was a commissioner at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and, traveled the country talking about the ADA in the workplace. And one of the things that she said that really made sense to me is if you want people to change their attitudes towards disabled people, the fastest way to achieve that is to work alongside somebody with a disability who's doing a good job. And it's one thing to see people in restaurants or movie theaters or go to school with people. It's another thing to work with them on a team to accomplish a task at work. And in her mind, that's really when the attitudes start to change, because the disabled person stops being their disability and starts being viewed as a colleague who can actually produce and who you want to work with on other stuff.
Yeah, of course. I also am kind of picking up on some of APHC's priorities, especially in this upcoming year, are like UBI and housing, of course, which has been a big focus for us in the past, as well as the fight around care courts. Um, and I'm curious how you think about economic justice and how an economic justice analysis kind of benefits and builds power for disabled people.
Yeah, no. So when Congress passed the ADA, they announced four goals for federal policy. So these were goals were supposed to inform everything the federal government did as it related to disabled people. Equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. And the concept was that we have this civil rights law that explains what discrimination means, defines disability and disability discrimination, but it's also pointing us in a direction that's much bigger than the law itself. And the direction was around these four goals. So I like to look at those goals and then look at how we spend money to support disabled people. The four programs that we spend the most money on are SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income, Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, Medicaid, and Medicare. Those four programs, hundreds of billions of dollars spent. And the definition of disability, that's the front door to most of that money, was written in 1956. So in 1956, we said the way we're going to decide if you have enough of a disability to get cash from the government is you're going to have to get a letter from a doctor that says that you have a physical or mental impairment that's going to result in death or last at least 12 months that will prevent you from engaging in substantial gainful activity. And most people understand that definition to mean I have a disability that prevents me from working. And if you're not able to say that and prove that with medical evidence, then you don't get health care, you don't get help getting out of bed, you don't get cash to pay your rent. So that is the thing you have to do. And I just feel like it's so wrong, to ask an 18-year-old to prove to the government that they can't work in order to get the supports that they need to work when they haven't even had an opportunity to try to work. It's just really bad policy. Um, and we've been living with it for a really long time. So I'm excited that the All People's Health Collective wants to modernize the disability benefit programs so that they actually support people to be part of the middle class and to have the kind of choices in their lives that other people take for granted. I like universal basic income because it forms a baseline that we can build on. So when I look at the economic justice agenda of the All People's Health Collective, there's two pieces to it that I think are both important, probably equally important. One is to get universal basic income for everyone, so people get used to the idea that income support is a normal thing and is healthy and can address some equity issues that are clearly plaguing California and many other states. But also, the universal basic income should interact with a robust, modernized disability benefit system so that people who need more than that guaranteed basic income to have a level playing field are able to get what they need and save money and work and not experience punishment when they go out and try to work or save money.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, yeah, thanks for sharing all of that. And yeah, I'm also just thinking about what you said that the definition of disability was created in 1956, and it's sort of thought of as this disability is like something that just happens to you. It's outside of social and economic stressors. But I think what you're pointing to is that disability is a spectrum, and poverty itself is disabling, incarceration is disabling, homelessness is disabling, right? All of that.
And disability
Um,
is also not static. Yeah, the person who helped to create the disability studies field was a sociologist named Irv Zola. He was based in Brandeis, but I had a chance to hear him speak once, and he said the question is not do you have a disability, but how many and in what combination. And I think over the course of our lives, we all move in and out of disability, and it ends up being pretty arbitrary what we choose to call a disability or not. But yes, absolutely, poverty can just living in poverty can create disabilities. Living in poverty also can create barriers to access to healthcare. So it can also make it harder for you to document your disability. And the importance of documenting your disability is more important when you're living in poverty, because documenting your
Mhm.
disability is a way to get a check to help you, pay the rent. So there's just a lot of ways that our system kind of pushes people down, keeps people down, and punishes them in a variety of ways when they try to move up economically.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, just going back a little bit, to, I guess, more of your personal history and experience working both in federal level and the state level. I'm kind of curious what brought you to do work at the state level after, being in DC for so long, and then how you see the differences between working, at the federal level versus at the state level, particularly in California, which, as we know, is a very special place, although also, very much a bellwether for political trends around the country
Sure.
often.
Yeah, as I said before, I feel like I've had the same job my whole career, and I still feel like I'm in that job. So what brought me to California was a unique opportunity to lead a ginormous organization that I thought was kind of punching below its weight. Like I thought for an organization our size, we should be on the cutting edge of every disability issue, and we should be forcing California to be the best state in the country for disabled people. And I didn't feel like that was happening. So that was one motivator for me. Another was both of my children were here at the time, so I didn't want to be 3,000 miles away from them. And then another motivator for me was the 30 years that I spent on the East Coast, four in Boston, 26 years working in DC, living in Baltimore. I kind of felt like I was in exile. I grew up in LA. Like California is a vibe, and when you're in Baltimore, it's also a vibe, and I love Baltimore, but it's just not the same vibe. So there was a part of me that I came back to California a lot, all 30 years. I came back a lot. There's a part of me that just felt like when I'm in California, I can breathe better. It feels more open. It feels more um, vital in some ways. There's something about the water, the land, the people. Um, I really love California. So when this opportunity came open, for me, it was almost like a religious calling. I felt called to come back to my home state at this stage in my career, which is, I'm probably in the last third of my career, certainly. Um, it was appealing to me to try to make an impact in the state where I grew up.
Oh, I'm almost moved as a lifelong East Coaster. Um, and could you just talk a little bit about maybe the second half of that question? Are there any dynamics that you see in California that you think are really interesting and that people should sort of be
Sure.
attuned to in the way that like California politics works and
Yeah.
disability
So
advocacy?
so I have to say, when I was doing this work in DC, I wasn't paying a lot of attention to California. I was paying attention to the disability leaders from California, but I wasn't paying attention to what the state legislature was doing in California. So when I got here, I remember asking my policy director, I was used to having access to politicians in DC, pretty much any politician in DC. So when I got to California, I asked my policy director, who does the governor talk to about disabilities? This was in February of 2020 when I started, right before the pandemic. The governor was Gavin Newsom. He was in his first term, still a relatively fresh face. And my policy director said, Mayor Steinberg. And I said, why does he talk to the mayor of Sacramento about disability issues? And he said, well, Mayor Steinberg has a kid with mental health disability and has been a champion and a mentor for the governor. And the governor kind of sees him as an expert. And I quickly came to realize that disabled people and disability-led organizations in California had almost no access to the governor and had almost no political power. So much less power than we had in Washington, D.C. And I just couldn't understand how it got that way. I mean, there's a part of me that feels like anything like that ultimately is a failure in leadership. I think the disability movement in California had extraordinary leaders like Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann kind of in the early phases of our movement. And we got some big successes. You know, the independent living movement was launched from California. It became a global movement of, you know, government-funded, disability-led organizations trying to help disabled people live in the community with full lives, with control over their lives. Um, but I just feel like we got complacent. I mean, I haven't done a full analysis of how it happened, but I think we had so much success that people stopped doing the organizing. They stopped doing the power building. They stopped holding the government accountable because they were in the government and they felt like people were listening to them. So yeah, I think our state kind of went on a decline, and you know, having grown up in California in the 70s and 80s, I think Proposition 13 had a huge impact on the ability of the state to support disabled people in a robust way because it took so much money out of the coffers of the government. And so, yeah, I have lots of reasons why I think California got to be the way it is, but I've been extraordinarily frustrated with Governor Newsom and the way that he does policy. He reminds me of Bill Clinton at his worst. They're both very charismatic, both very smart, both like to get in the weeds of policy, but they both have no moral core. Um, and that's a kind of a dangerous combination. So I really hope at the end of the day that we get a governor who has a strong moral core, who connects with the authentic leaders of our disability movement, doesn't accept a proxy, but actually talks to authentic leaders of the disability movement and asks us, what do you want me to do as governor? And then does it.
Yeah, that is a cutting indictment of Governor Newsom. And it's really cool to see how DRC is also fighting to change that culture through, something like the power building unit, and kind of focusing on working and being in community. Um, I guess following on both strands, or two strands of what you were just talking about. What are some of the things, maybe three things that you're most worried about in California, or just more generally with regards to disability rights? And then what are three things that are giving you hope right now?
Yeah, I love that question. You know, as somebody with bipolar disorder, I like having, a couple of extremes to bounce between. So, starting with the things to be depressed about. Number one for me, and we've already touched on it, is that we still have non-disabled experts, quote unquote experts, who are speaking for disabled people. And we don't feel like we need the expertise of the actual disabled people. That's happening in California around unhoused, unsheltered people. We're not talking to the folks who are unhoused and unsheltered about what's going to work for them. We have a bunch of experts who are having opinions about what's going to work for that population. And one of the groups that has the ear of the governor is big city mayors. And I feel like the big city mayors just want to erase the problem, but they want to do it in the language of care court. You know, that they want to say that we care about these poor, mentally disabled people, drug addicted people who have no idea how to help themselves. So we're going to come in and save them. That is the white savior approach to homelessness that our state has embraced in a bipartisan way. And it's not effective. It's not going to work. It's going to result in lots of harm. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party in California doesn't seem to care. And the Republican Party is right along with them. So that's really frustrating. Uh, the second thing I'm worried about is the war on fraud, which was the thing that the President of the United States announced in the State of the Union address and said that his vice president was going to lead this for his administration. I think what we saw with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, in the beginning of this term for President Trump, is that anything they don't like, they call it fraud, waste, and abuse. And it seems like as long as you give it that label in this administration, you can end anything you want to end. And I think what you're going to see happening, and we are seeing happening, is they're going after programs that support disabled people, especially programs where disabled people have control over the supports and services in their life. And they're going to favor programs where disabled people are in congregate settings and they have very little control over their lives. So that's really concerning that's the war on fraud is basically a war on disabled people. And I don't know where it's going to stop. Like they could call everything that we do fraud if they want to. And if we're having a debate with them about fraud in the Medicaid program, then we've already lost. Like the issue is not fraud. The issue is you just took $1 trillion out of Medicaid. So instead of saying, how are we going to make up for that? They want to take more out of Medicaid and call it fraud. So I'm worried about that. And then the third thing I'm worried about is the weakness of disability-led organizations at every level, the national level, the state level, the local level. For the most part, we're small, we're vulnerable, we're struggling, and we have to develop new muscles in order to survive. And I don't know that we're all going to be able to do that. So those are the three things I would say I'm the most worried about. And then the things that get, and I'm happy if any of this is confusing, I'm happy to explain what I'm saying. In terms of the things that are giving me hope, first, political leaders like Latifah Simon, who's from the East Bay in California. She's a freshman member of Congress who's blind and who has a strong disability identity, is also Black and has a strong intersectional identity. Adina Ishi, who's the mayor of Berkeley, also disabled, proud of her disability, intersectional leader. And they're both young. I mean, I'm 60, so everybody seems young to me, but by political standards, they both, if they want to, will have a political career that could last for decades. And then Jeff Gonzalez, who is a disabled veteran from Indio in California, who wants to be an activist to protect disabled people from Governor Newsom. And I love it that we have a Republican disabled veteran who's willing to take on the Democratic governor who nobody else seems willing to take on. So those are three people in the political space that give me hope. My staff gives me a lot of hope. We have a wonderful staff. I know you've worked with Carolina, with Sam, with other folks on our staff. I think we have a very talented, very dynamic, diverse staff, and I feel very blessed to be able to work with them. I've never had this kind of talent, the size of the staff and the depth of the talent is like nothing I've ever experienced, and it's exciting. So it definitely gives me hope. And then the last thing for me is my faith. I feel like the work that I do is the work I was put on the planet to do. I feel like all the opportunities that have come my way came because God had a plan for me, and I've tried to discern my jobs, what's a good job for me based on what do I feel called to do. So I think my faith helps keep me hopeful and helps me feel like whatever feels like a negative power, the governor, the state legislature, the White House, those powers pale in comparison to the power of God. So ultimately, I can't allow myself to feel that those powers are ultimately going to win.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks so much, Andy, for giving us the chance to learn more about you and your path and how you think about the work that you do. And yeah, it's just really inspiring to sort of learn from like that kind of groundedness and moral clarity. And I know that Carolina and Sam and everyone at APHC also really looks up to it. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that listeners know, or any questions that you feel like we haven't covered that you want to answer today?
Well, I guess one thing that I was in a board meeting earlier this week, actually yesterday, and we had a icebreaker question, which was, "Who's your hero?" So I'd like to end with that because I found I loved listening to the answers. Um, but my hero is a guy named Justin Dart. Justin was on the stage with President Bush when he signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. He didn't call himself an organizer, but he was an organizer. He was a guy who had polio, who went to every state in the country to make the case for the Americans with Disabilities Act. He went with his wife Yoshiko. They traveled the country. He was in a wheelchair, and they collected discrimination diaries. So they collected stories from people who had experienced discrimination, and they brought that back and delivered it to a congressional task force that was led by Major Owens, who was a congressman from Brooklyn, who often does not get the credit he deserves as a champion for the ADA. He was a black congressman from Brooklyn who really helped organize the case on the ground for the ADA and was the chair of a key subcommittee in the House that had jurisdiction over civil rights. We would not have an Americans with Disabilities Act without Major Owens. But Justin Dart, for me, taught me of the power of love. You know, Cornell West says in order to lead people, you have to love people. In order to save people, you have to serve people. Justin lived that Cornell West quote. When you were with Justin, you felt love. When he gave a speech, the end of his speech, he always said, "I love you," and he meant it. When you had a one-on-one phone call with him, literally every time, the end of the phone call, he said, "I love you," and he meant it. He had the ability to just channel love everywhere he went, and he brought out the best in everyone, and he saw a role for everyone. And I think in the disability movement, that's a special skill because there are disabled people who sometimes nobody can figure out what to do with. Justin Dart figured out something to do with everyone. Um, and like when he would give speeches, he had all these like little ways of creating little insurrections. Like he would give a speech to a audience of high-powered people in DC, and he would acknowledge people at the beginning of his speech. And he always acknowledged people in the audience who nobody else would have acknowledged, you know, because he was trying to send a message that the United States senator in the audience is not more important than this grassroots person who's doing kick-ass work on the ground. So he had a lot of things like that, that he was just countercultural, and he totally inspired me. I was born on August 28th. I am born on August 28th. He was born on August 29th. So I also felt like we had a Virgo bond. And he also, even though his kind of the disability that he was the most famous for was polio and his wheelchair, he also had depression, which he was very open about. And he often told me he thought his depression was a bigger deal for him than his physical disability.
Hmm. Hmm. What's that quote? Justice is love in public, the Cornell West one.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
beautiful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andy. Yeah, this is a great podcast and great to hear you speak.